I was staring intently at the boy standing at the door, wearing a black shirt and trousers, an epitome of masculine elegance. His beauty left me astounded. I had seen many men in my life, but I had never seen one as handsome as him. He was tall, with a fair complexion, and his blue eyes made him even more striking. I kept looking at him, lost in admiration, until I was jolted by my father's voice, who had just entered the house from behind the boy. My father said, "No, Shaba, this is Shamir Khan, our new driver. You were facing a lot of issues traveling to and from college. It was becoming difficult for me to leave the office to pick you up from college, so I've arranged a separate driver for you. From now on, whenever you need to go somewhere, you'll go with Shamir Khan." I was stunned to hear my father's words and looked at the boy in surprise. He appeared to be around 25, 26 years old, extremely handsome and youthful. He looked more like a prince from a palace or the king of some kingdom. But was he really my new driver? A driver so handsome? I was lost in these thoughts when my father called him in. "Khan, come in." Shamir Khan walked in with grace, his head bowed in respect. His silky hair was neatly combed and settled on his forehead, and his broad forehead was a clear sign of his noble lineage. He stood in front of me, hands folded, still with his eyes lowered. My father introduced him, saying, "Yain, Khan, this is my daughter Nosheba, and wherever she needs to go, it will be your responsibility to take her. Just make sure you drive carefully." Shamir Khan smiled and said, "Sir, don't worry. I have many years of experience. I will take care of Miss and drive carefully." My father handed him the car keys and said, "Khan, come to our house at 8 a.m. every day, and your duty will end at 8 p.m. during this time. You will be available whenever she needs to go somewhere." After my father left, I couldn't help but smile as I looked Shamir Khan up and down. "So you are our new driver. Well, let's take a test drive." At this, a slight smile appeared on his face, though he didn't lift his gaze. I stood up and called out to Kala Batul, our housemaid. "Kala, I'm going out." I always informed her whenever I left the house because she kept my father updated on everything. My mother's shadow had long since passed away, and it was my father who had sacrificed his life for me. He had never remarried and had instead hired a maid to stay with me 24/7. Batul Kala had played the role of a mother in my life. After informing her, I stepped out of the house. Last year, my father had gifted me this black car for my birthday. I had wanted to learn how to drive it, but my father hadn't allowed it. He was worried that something might happen while driving, but there was a deeper reason behind this concern. Anyway, I sat in the back of the car, and Khan took the driver's seat. In a short time, he was driving the car expertly while I, sitting behind, asked him to speed up. I enjoyed the thrill of the speed, but Khan drove cautiously. When I told him to increase the speed, he refused. "Madam, the traffic is heavy, and this speed is already too fast. It might be dangerous," he explained. His response made me upset, and I said, "You don't seem like a skilled driver. I prefer drivers who speed up and race through these roads. My previous driver used to drive very fast." He didn't respond to my remark. I decided to take a loop around and return home, not to test his driving, but to check his behavior. I wanted to see if he, like the previous driver, would glance at me through the rearview mirror. The last driver had done that constantly and drove recklessly, which led my father to fire him. The day before, my father had told me that he had found a new driver for me, and he would start the next day. I had replied that I hoped he was a decent one. My father had assured me he was a very good young man and a good driver as well. I had tested him now and was convinced that he was indeed a well-mannered man, who hadn't once looked at me. He must be a Pathan, I thought, as Pathans are known to be very respectful and modest. By the end of the drive, I was fully satisfied with Shamir Khan. After spending a long time roaming around, I returned home and went to my room. Shamir Khan stayed in the garden outside until 8 p.m. Since I didn't need to go anywhere, he came to my room's door right at 8. He knocked gently and, with respect, said, "Miss, my shift is over now. May I go home?" I was tempted to tease him and shook my head in denial, saying, "No." He looked up at me, startled. When his gaze met mine, my heart skipped a beat. His eyes were so beautiful, so deep that I felt like I was drowning in them. I kept looking at him for several moments, while he quickly lowered his gaze, feeling my stare. Miss, should I not go? He asked in the simplest manner. Without thinking, I blurted out, I'm completely alone. Could you sit with me and talk for a while? He stood frozen for a moment, clearly surprised by my words, and I too felt embarrassed by my own invitation. He was an unfamiliar man who had only just come to our house. How could I invite him into my room? Quickly, I regained control and laughed, saying, No, no, Khan, your shift is over. I was just joking. You should leave now. Tomorrow morning, I'll leave for college at 8, so come a little earlier. He smiled and left after saying, Okay, ma'am. After his departure, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His eyes had a depth that pulled me in. I didn't know why my mind kept returning to him. Sometimes the fate of beautiful faces is not so kind. He was meant to be a king, ruling over palaces. But instead, he had become a driver for my car. And I was just an average-looking girl, blessed with everything. My own large mansion, my father's successful business, and a perfect life. The only thing missing was my mother. My mother had passed away in an accident, and that was why my father never allowed me to drive. My mother had always loved driving fast, and one day, while she was out shopping with her friends, her speed led to a fatal crash with a truck. The car was completely wrecked, and my mother's body was in a terrible state. Since then, my father had developed a deep fear of driving. He and my mother had had a love marriage, and after her passing, he had been left all alone. I was only 6 years old when she passed, and my father raised me alone. He imposed many restrictions on me when it came to driving. I too, like my mother, had a strong desire for speed while driving. But my father had been so strict that I had never even been allowed to sit in the driver's seat. Despite turning 19, I had never been permitted to learn driving. I could have easily gotten a driving license, but my father always said, You're just like your mother. She had a crazy love for speed, and so do you. I don't want you to learn to drive. My father had always hired a driver for me, and this time, it was Shah Mir Khan, who had made my heart waver. I hadn't realized when I had fallen asleep, lost in thoughts of Khan. The next morning when I woke up for college, I smiled as the thought of Khan taking me to college crossed my mind. My heart had become strangely emotional about him. I quickly got ready and deliberately applied a dark lipstick, leaving my hair open over my shoulders, something I rarely did. At 8, Shamir Khan was already standing at the door, having prepared the car. I picked up my bag and stepped outside. As soon as I saw him, a deep smile spread across my face. I got into the car and sat in the back while he began driving. I kept sneaking glances at his face. Sometimes I'd look through the window, and other times I'd glance at him sideways. I just wanted to keep looking at him, and before I knew it, we had arrived at the college. My friends were standing in front of the college, and they immediately recognized my car. As they approached, their first glance fell on Shamir Khan, and they were all taken aback. As soon as I got out of the car, my friend Nita asked, No, Shaba, who is this? Is he your cousin? I burst out laughing and said, Oh no, he's my driver. His name is Shamir Khan. My father hired him for me. I had the last driver removed after I complained. Nita jumped in surprise and exclaimed, Such a handsome driver. He looks like a hero from a drama, or could easily do modeling. How did he end up being your driver? I laughed even harder and replied, Yes, that was my first thought too, but the truth is, he is my driver. Nita said, If I had a driver like him, I'd never want to go home. After listening to Nita's comment, the rest of my friends burst into laughter, and I thought to myself, what could be a better compliment than this? I didn't lack money and there was no one to stop me. On the way back from college, I decided to go shopping on my own. So after entering the college, I went to class, and at the time of dismissal, when I came out, Shamir Khan was already waiting for me. I got into the car and said, Khan, take the car to Tariq Road. He was surprised but said nothing and turned the car towards Tariq Road. I then told him, Khan, I need to shop, park the car somewhere convenient, and come with me. He looked at me in confusion and said, Ma'am, why would I come with you? I responded with a slight annoyance. Who will carry the shopping bags? He immediately agreed and nodded. However, my intention wasn't just to have him carry my shopping bags. I wanted to spend some time with him. He parked the car in the parking lot and followed me. I deliberately slowed my pace to match his and walked alongside him. When we reached a clothing store, I started asking him for his opinion. The first time I asked, "How does this outfit look?" He was taken aback. He then said, "What can I say? These are women's clothes. I've never done women's shopping." I was surprised and asked, "Don't you have any women at home?" He replied, "I've been living in this city for many years, so now I've forgotten everything." At his response, I was even more surprised. I then asked, "What do you mean? You've never gone shopping with a woman?" He casually placed his hand on a black suit and added, "I don't really remember these things anymore." I raised an eyebrow and followed his choice, picking out several items, all of which, coincidentally, were black. It seemed that black was his favorite color. He wore a black shirt and pants, and every item I bought in his presence was also black. After spending a lot of time with him, I took him to a hotel for dinner and told him to sit down and eat with me. At first he refused, but when I became upset, he reluctantly sat down. I then asked him, "Why are you working this job?" He shared that his father had cancer and he needed money for his treatment. His family lived in the village, and once he had saved enough, he planned to bring his father to the city for treatment. He then surprised me further by revealing, "During the day, I work for you, and at night, I work as a waiter at a hotel. I'm trying to save money as quickly as I can." Hearing about his financial struggles made me feel deeply sad. The next day, when he came to pick me up, I tried to offer him some money, but he refused. That's when I realized how proud and self-respecting he was. He hadn't asked for anything extra. Soon I found myself getting attached to him. I had started looking forward to seeing him, and without him, I felt restless. Sundays were the hardest for me since he had the day off. My father was always busy with work, leaving me to spend Sundays alone, either talking to friends on the phone or studying. But that wasn't enough. I yearned for someone to share my thoughts with, someone who could ease my loneliness. Since Khan had come into my life, I had begun to open up to him because he listened to me quietly, without interrupting, and never gave me any advice. Sometimes I would notice a slight smile on his face, but usually his expression remained neutral. A few days later, I found out that my father was planning to remarry. The news felt like a shock. I sat in front of him asking, "Dad, why do you need to get married again? You never remarried all these years, and now why are you planning to do so?" He replied, "My dear, it's out of necessity. I want to get married before you do, so that after you leave, I won't be alone. And the woman I'm marrying is also my business partner. This marriage will be beneficial for my business." I shook my head in disbelief and retreated to my room, crying. I couldn't accept the idea that my father, at his age, was planning to marry again, especially when I was about to be married myself. The next day, Shamir Khan noticed my swollen face and was clearly concerned, but he didn't ask anything. Later, on the way back from college, I got into the car with him and he spontaneously asked, "Ma'am, is everything okay? Are you troubled?" I looked at him. I told him, "Take the car on a road where there isn't much traffic. I need some peace." After hearing me, he took me to a quiet area where houses were under construction, and there was emptiness as far as the eye could see. I told him, "Shamir Khan, come sit in the back seat." He was taken aback by my request, but seeing my condition, he quietly moved to the back seat. I gave him a deep look, and crossing all boundaries, expressed my love for him, because I knew that the feelings in my heart for him were filled with love. For a long while he sat there, stunned, not saying a word. But then, suddenly, he quickly got up from the back seat, moved to the front, and started driving the car. I called out to him, "Khan, what are you doing?" He responded, "Ma'am, if your father finds out that you're expressing love for me, he will fire me right away. I need my father's life to be saved, and I'm working hard for that. But if your father finds out, he'll throw me out of this job." Shamir Khan kept speaking rapidly, his face full of fear as he was terrified of losing his job. Meanwhile, I, feeling the loneliness of my life, placed my hand on his arm from behind and said, "Khan, I want your love. If you say so, I will do anything for you. But I can't live alone anymore." He drove me to my home, parked the car, got out, and stood respectfully with his hands folded. His body language told me that he didn't want to say anything further. I spent the rest of the day crying in my room. Later that evening, my father married a beautiful young woman and brought her home as my stepmother. After seeing her, I realized why my father had remarried. She was very attractive and wealthy, and she fluttered around him like a butterfly. It was clear that my father had felt the need for a companion at his age, and when such a woman entered his life, he decided to marry her. But I couldn't accept it. I didn't even talk to my stepmother properly and stayed locked in my room. The next day, as I was leaving for college, I packed my purse with a lot of money and went out with Khan. After driving for a while, I told him, "Let's not go to college. Turn the car in the other direction." At first, he was surprised, but he obeyed and turned the car. I directed him along the new route, and soon I asked him to stop. When he did, I took out a lot of money from my purse and handed it to him, saying, "This money is for you. I want to help you. You can use it for your father's treatment." He hesitated, but took the money and said, "But how will I repay this?" I replied, "I don't want this money back, but in return, you have to do what I ask." He was confused and asked, "What do you want me to do, ma'am?" I smiled and said, "Last night I found out that your father has come to the city. He is very sick and needs treatment. Take this money, go home, and take your father to the hospital. I don't want anything more from you. Just pray for me that peace comes into my life." When he heard me mention his father, he was taken aback and asked, "How do you know my father is here in the city?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I said, "Get out of the car and go take your father to the hospital. I'll meet you there on." He said, "Ma'am, let me drop you off at college first." I replied, "No, I don't want to go to college. Just give me the car keys and go." He was perplexed and asked, "What will you do with the car keys? How will you get home?" I smiled and said, "There is a friend's house nearby. I will go there and ask her driver to drop me home." After hearing this, he gave me the keys and drove away, satisfied. I had lied to him. There was no friend's house. I took the keys, sat in the driver's seat, and began driving. I had learned some basic driving in secret from the previous driver, and now, in my anger, I was determined to leave the city and find some peace, somewhere far away. I knew that Shamir would never be mine, and my father no longer cared about me. He was busy planning his honeymoon with his new wife. I sped the car down the road, and before I knew it, I collided with a fast-moving truck. When I regained consciousness, I found myself lying in a hospital bed, and my father was standing there crying. He rushed to my side, kissed my forehead, and said, "Daughter, what have you done?" I turned my face away and said, "I don't want to talk to you. You remarried, built a new life, and left me all alone. Shamir also doesn't want to accept my love." My father was taken aback and said, "Shamir told me how you gave him money and sent him away, but he didn't tell me that you loved him." I smiled faintly and replied, "He's afraid of losing his job. Now I don't want this life anymore. After all the restrictions you've placed on me, in the end, what you did broke my heart. I always followed your words, but you went ahead and remarried. I thought you would never bring anyone else into my life, but you shattered my heart," I said with tears in my eyes. My father smiled faintly and said, "You misunderstood, my dear. I did all this so I wouldn't be alone in my old age. I wanted to arrange your marriage, but before doing so, I needed to make sure there was a woman in the house because a house is made complete with a woman." He continued, "If you had told me that you love Shamir, I would have spoken to him. He is indeed a good and honest person. But you crossed all limits with your recklessness. You didn't know how to drive, yet you drove so fast. Thank God your life was spared. Since your accident, Shamir has been very worried. He spent all his time in prayer, hoping for your well-being. I will talk to him about your relationship, but in the future, don't make such mistakes. You know you were unconscious for an entire day, and now, only today, have you regained consciousness." Listening to my father, I was left speechless. I had been unconscious for a whole day, but now, as I sat in front of him, everything seemed clearer. After being discharged from the hospital, my stepmother also lovingly explained that she would never come between my father and me. My father had solidified my relationship with Shamir, and he had also started the treatment for Shamir's father. Now I am happy in my life, but sometimes when I look back at my past, I'm amazed at how I made such a big mistake and put my life in danger. If something had happened to me, perhaps my father wouldn't have been able to live through it. I should have accepted his second marriage with an open heart, because my father has just as much of a right to life as I do.